History remembers the flash of the bayonet. It remembers the thunder of the cannonade, the desperate bravery of the square formation, and the stoic discipline of the thin red line, standing firm against overwhelming odds. We are drawn to the dramatic crescendo of battle, the moments of supreme courage and violence that decide the fate of nations in a single afternoon. When we visualize the British Empire at its zenith, we see the scarlet coat, the shimmering steel, and the Union Jack fluttering over a smoke-filled field. We see the final charge at Waterloo or the stubborn defense of Rorke's Drift. These are the images that fill our paintings and our cinema screens. But the reality of warfare in the 18th and 19th centuries was rarely so romantic. For every hour a soldier spent in combat, he spent months marching, waiting, and enduring the elements. In these long stretches of tedium, the greatest enemy was not the opposing army. It was not the French cuirassier or the Zulu warrior. The true enemies were hunger, thirst, disease, and the sheer, crushing weight of distance. A soldier with an empty stomach cannot march. A regiment without ammunition cannot hold a line. An army without clean water dissolves into a hospital ward long before it ever sees a battlefield. The true secret of British imperial dominance was not found solely in the courage of its infantry or the brilliance of its commanders, though both played their part. The secret lay in the unglamorous, often tedious, and immensely expensive world of logistics. It was the ability to move men and material across thousands of miles of ocean, to land them on hostile shores, and to keep them fed, clothed, and armed for years on end. While other nations relied on the bravery of their soldiers to win wars, Britain relied on the efficiency of its clerks, the reach of its merchant navy, and the depth of its treasury. This is the story of the hidden hand that guided the Redcoat to victory, the invisible engine of empire that turned the chaotic art of war into a precise industrial science. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, one must first grasp the logistical nightmare of the era. In the 18th century, there were no radios to coordinate movements, no airplanes to drop supplies, and no trucks to haul heavy equipment. Information travelled at the speed of a horse. Cargo travelled at the speed of the wind. Sending an army to North America or India was an enterprise fraught with peril. A fleet could be scattered by a storm, leaving thousands of men stranded without provisions. Food rotted in the hulls of damp wooden ships. Water turned stagnant in barrels. By the time a British force arrived at its destination, it was often already decimated by scurvy and dysentery, fighting for survival before a single shot was fired. Yet, despite these limitations, Great Britain managed to project power on a scale the world had never seen. They did not do this by accident. They did it by professionalizing the business of supply. While their rivals on the continent, particularly the vast armies of France, often operated on the principle of predation, living off the land and stripping the local countryside bare, the British adopted a different philosophy. They understood that an army that steals from the local population creates new enemies with every step it takes. An army that relies on looting will starve when the land is barren. Instead, the British developed the thick supply line. They transformed the Royal Navy into a floating highway, connecting the factories of the Midlands to the front lines of the colonies. They established a global network of depots and storehouses, ensuring that a redcoat in Calcutta used the same ammunition as a redcoat in Quebec. They turned the boring necessity of procurement into a strategic weapon. The British soldier became the most expensive soldier in the world to maintain, a heavy investment by the state. But this cost purchased reliability. It purchased an army that did not mutiny for lack of pay, did not desert for lack of food, and did not disintegrate when the harvest failed. In the grand calculus of imperial conquest, the ledger book was as mighty as the sword. Nowhere was this clash of philosophies more evident than in the scorched hills of the Iberian Peninsula during the Napoleonic Wars. Here, the British Army, under the command of Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, faced off against the formidable war machine of Imperial France. The French system of logistics was born of the Revolution, prioritizing speed and mass above all else. Napoleon's armies were designed to move like a swarm of locusts. They carried little, relying instead on the maxim that war must feed war. French soldiers were expected to forage, a polite military term that, in practice, meant stripping the peasantry of their grain, livestock, and wine. In the fertile plains of Central Europe, where harvests were bountiful and populations dense, this system worked with terrifying efficiency. It allowed Napoleon to outmarch and outmaneuver his enemies, unencumbered by slow-moving wagon trains. But Spain and Portugal were not the rich farmlands of Germany or Italy. The terrain was rugged, the roads were treacherous goat paths, and the summers reduced the landscape to a parched dust bowl. When the French armies descended upon the peninsula, they found a land that could barely support its own population, let alone an invading host of hundreds of thousands. As the French soldiers fanned out to scavenge for food, they found empty granaries and hidden livestock. Desperation turned to brutality. They tore down houses for firewood and tortured villagers to reveal hidden stores of grain. This predation ignited a furious backlash. The Spanish peasantry rose up in a savage guerrilla war, ambushing foraging parties and cutting supply lines. The French army found itself in a paradox. To survive, they had to disperse to find food, but to fight, they had to concentrate. If they dispersed, they were picked off by guerrillas. If they concentrated, they starved. Into this cauldron marched Wellington, bringing with him a radically different approach. He understood that in a land of scarcity, the only way to maintain a fighting force was to bring everything with him. He famously remarked that if he had the power, he would starve the French out of Spain, while ensuring his own men were well supplied. This was not an idle boast. It was a calculated operational strategy. Wellington established a rigorous system of supply depots, fed by the Royal Navy at the port of Lisbon. From these coastal hubs, a complex vascular system of logistics extended inland. The backbone of this system was the mule. The rough Iberian terrain rendered traditional heavy wagons useless, so the British Commissariat Department hired thousands of local muleteers. These long, winding trains of pack animals, laden with biscuit, salt beef and rum, became the lifeline of the army. But the true genius of Wellington's strategy lay in how these supplies were procured. He issued strict orders that looting would be punished by death, a discipline he enforced with the lash and the noose. When the British Army needed local resources, they did not take them, they bought them. Crucially, they paid in gold and silver coin, often supplied directly by the British Treasury. In a war-torn region where paper currency was worthless and trust was non-existent, the British sovereign was a hard, undeniable reality. The result was a miraculous economic inversion. Spanish farmers who would bury their crops to hide them from the French would willingly travel miles to sell their produce to the British camp. Wellington essentially weaponized the local market. While French marshals saw their armies wither away from malnutrition and disease, spending half their energy just trying to stay alive, the British regiments remained cohesive and combat-ready. This logistical superiority allowed Wellington to choose his battles. He could remain in the field when the French were forced to retreat in search of food. He could hold defensive lines like the famous Torres Vedras, knowing that his men had ample stocks of salted meat and wine behind the fortifications, while the besieging French force outside the walls slowly disintegrated into a starving rabble. The British victory in the peninsula was not merely a triumph of the line formation or the riflemen. It was a victory of credit and capital. It proved that a well-fed army, backed by a nation willing to pay its way, could outlast a larger force that preyed upon the very people it sought to conquer. The British soldier's greatest advantage was not just the musket in his hand, but the guarantee that his next meal was already on its way. While Wellington demonstrated the power of logistics on land, the ultimate guarantor of British supply lines was the sea. For the great continental powers of Europe, France, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, Warfare was geologically tethered. Their armies were bound by the limitations of geography, moving along muddy roads that dissolved into quagmires under autumn rains, or froze into ruts in winter. A wagon train, the lifeblood of a continental army, was a horribly inefficient mechanism. It required thousands of horses or oxen, each of which had to be fed and watered, consuming a significant portion of the very supplies they were transporting. The further an army marched from its depot, the less efficient the supply chain became, until the friction of distance brought the entire machine to a grinding halt. Britain, however, was an island nation that looked outward to the blue water. It did not view the ocean as a barrier, but as a highway, a frictionless surface over which immense tonnage could be moved, with a speed and economy that land powers could scarcely comprehend. A single merchant vessel or transport ship could carry the cargo of hundreds of wagons, travelling day and night without the need for fodder or rest. The Royal Navy, therefore, was not merely a fighting force designed to sink enemy fleets. It was the armed guard of the world's most extensive delivery service. To sustain this global reach, the British Empire constructed a necklace of fortified depots that encircled the globe. These were not random conquests. They were chosen with the precise calculation of a quartermaster. Gibraltar, Malta, Cape Town, Aden, Singapore, and Hong Kong served as the strategic way stations of the empire. In the age of sail, they provided safe harbours for refitting and fresh water. As the 19th century progressed and steam power began to replace canvas, these ports evolved into vital coaling stations, the Victorian equivalent of gas stations in a world without other fuel sources. A British steamship could project power into the farthest reaches of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean because it was never far from a friendly pile of Welsh coal. This network of prepositioned supplies meant that the British Army rarely started from zero. When a crisis erupted in a remote colony, a border skirmish in the northwest frontier, or an uprising in the Caribbean, the responding forces did not have to wait for supplies to be shipped all the way from London. They could draw upon the reserves held in these regional hubs. The warehouses of Cape Town or Bombay were stacked high with crates of muskets, barrels of gunpowder, and bales of uniforms, ready to be dispensed the moment the telegraph wires hummed with the news of war. Furthermore, the British military possessed a hidden reserve that no other nation could match: the merchant marine. The British commercial fleet was the largest in the world, a colossal armada of trading vessels that plied every ocean in search of profit. In times of peace, they carried tea, cotton, and spices. But in times of war, the government could charter this vast civilian capacity for military purposes. This synergy between the state and the private sector allowed Britain to scale its logistical footprint almost instantly. When troops needed to be surged to a conflict zone, the Admiralty did not need to build new transport ships. They simply rented the existing commercial infrastructure. Troop ships, converted from liners and cargo haulers, became floating barracks. They were cramped, smelling of tar, bilge water, and unwashed bodies, but they were effective. They allowed Britain to deposit a fully equipped army on a hostile coast, thousands of miles from home, complete with artillery, cavalry, and weeks of provisions. This blue water strategy meant that the British Empire could strike anywhere, at any time, with a logistical footprint that was self-sustaining. While Napoleon's Grande Armée froze on the steppes of Russia, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point and then snapped. The British Redcoat could stand on a beach in Africa or Asia, look out to sea, and see the masts of the Royal Navy on the horizon. A reassuring promise that ammunition, reinforcements, and news from home were never truly out of reach. The ocean was not a moat that isolated them. It was the umbilical cord that kept the empire alive. If the Peninsular War demonstrated the power of payment, and the dominance of the seas established the reach of the empire, it was the Abyssinian expedition of 1868 that stands as the ultimate cathedral of Victorian logistics. It is a campaign studied not for the ferocity of its combat, but for the sheer, audacious scale of its organisation. It remains to this day perhaps the most technically perfect military operation of the colonial era, a war won not by the bayonet, but by the steam engine and the spreadsheet. The crisis began when the Emperor Tewodros II of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, took a group of British missionaries and envoys hostage, imprisoning them in his mountain fortress of Magdala. He believed himself safe, and by any conventional measure, he was. Magdala sat perched atop a basalt cliff, 400 miles from the coast, surrounded by a labyrinth of scorched ravines and precipitous peaks. There were no roads, no bridges, and no local food sources sufficient to feed an invading army. To reach the hostages, a force would have to traverse a landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than a battlefield. The British government turned to the Bombay Army and Sir Robert Napier, a calm, methodical engineer from the Royal Engineers Corps. Napier did not rush. He did not issue rousing speeches about glory. Instead, he sat down and calculated the tonnage of water a man consumes in a day, the fodder required by a mule, and the coal needed to distill seawater. He understood that the enemy was not Tewodros. The enemy was the 400 miles of desolate rock standing between the Red Sea and the fortress. When Napier's fleet arrived at Zula on the Gulf of Zula, there was nothing but a flat, burning salt plain. Within weeks, the British had constructed a fully functioning industrial port. They built 2 piers extending nearly 1,000 feet into the sea to offload heavy equipment. They erected warehouses, hospitals, and bakeries. But the true marvel was the water. Knowing the local wells were insufficient, Napier brought massive condensation plants from the ships, setting up a desalination system that pumped thousands of gallons of fresh water a day, a feat of chemical engineering on the edge of a desert. From this beachhead, the hidden hand began to move inland. To conquer the mountains, Napier brought the Industrial Revolution with him. His engineers laid 20 miles of railway across the coastal plain to speed supplies to the foothills. He imported 44 Indian elephants, beasts of burden capable of carrying the heavy Armstrong rifled breech loading guns that would be needed to breach the gates of Magdala. These elephants were hoisted onto ships in Mumbai using custom-made slings, transported across the ocean, and then marched into the highlands of Africa. The logistical manifest reads like a list of impossible items for a military campaign. Alongside the ammunition and the rifles, the expedition carried ice-making machines, telegraph wires that were unspooled mile by mile to maintain instant communication with London, and thousands of mules, sourced from as far away as Spain and Persia. The army was a cosmopolitan travelling city. British Redcoats marched alongside Indian sepoys, Baluchis, and a labour corps of thousands. The march to Magdala took months. The column wound its way through passes so narrow that the artillery had to be disassembled and carried by hand. Yet the soldiers did not starve. The supply chain functioned with the rhythmic precision of a factory floor. When the British finally arrived at the foot of Magdala, they were tired but healthy, well-fed and fully armed. The Emperor Tewodros watched from his ramparts as this unstoppable machine assembled below him. When he finally ordered his warriors to charge, they were met by the disciplined volley fire of the Snyder-Enfield breech-loading rifles, weapons that could fire 10 rounds a minute, fed by the seemingly endless supply of ammunition Napier had carted up the mountains. The battle was brief. The logistical superiority was so overwhelming that the contest was effectively over before it began. The British stormed the fortress, rescued the hostages, and found the emperor dead by his own hand. But Napier's work was not done. In a final display of disciplined logistics, he ordered the systematic dismantling of his equipment. The army marched back to the coast, picked up their railway tracks, loaded their elephants back onto the ships, and left. They left behind no garrison, no colony, and no ruins. Only the silence of the desert returning to the salt plain. It was a surgical strike, executed with the weight of an empire, proving that for the British, no place on earth was truly inaccessible. The ability to transport supplies was only half the equation. The other half was ensuring that those supplies were actually useful once they arrived. In many armies of the 18th century, logistics was a chaotic affair of non-standardized equipment. A regiment raised in one province might carry muskets of a slightly different bore than a regiment raised in another. A replacement part forged in a local smithy might not fit a weapon manufactured in the capital. This lack of uniformity was a logistical nightmare, turning simple repairs into complex engineering problems and rendering ammunition stockpiles useless if they were sent to the wrong unit. The British Empire, however, approached war with the mindset of an industrialist. Long before the concept of the assembly line revolutionized civilian manufacturing, the British military adopted the principle of standardization. The supreme symbol of this philosophy was the land pattern musket, affectionately known to the troops as the Brown Bess. For over a century, from the frozen forests of Canada to the humid jungles of India, the Brown Bess was the ubiquitous arm of the British infantryman. While it underwent minor modifications, its core design and, crucially, its caliber remained consistent. It fired a massive .75 caliber lead ball. This meant that a cartridge rolled by boys in a factory in Woolwich could be shipped across the Atlantic and fired by a soldier in the 13 colonies without a second thought. If a flank company in the Peninsular War ran low on ammunition, they could borrow rounds from a line battalion next to them. This interchangeability created a seamless flow of lethality. The British supply chain did not need to worry about matching specific bullets to specific guns. They simply flooded the empire with .75 caliber lead, confident that it would fit every musket in the king's service. This drive for standardization extended beyond weaponry to the very fuel that kept the soldier moving: food. For centuries, armies had marched on their stomachs, but those stomachs were often filled with rotting meat and weevil-infested biscuits. Salted beef and pork, stored in wooden barrels, were the staples of long sea voyages, but they were heavy, required soaking to be edible, and offered little nutrition. In the tropical heat of the colonies, food spoilage was a constant, deadly adversary, often killing more men than enemy fire. In the early 19th century, the British military became an early adopter of a technology that would change warfare forever: the tin can. The process of preserving food in airtight iron canisters, pioneered by inventors like Peter Durand and industrialized by the firm Donkin, Hall and Gamble, offered a solution to the age-old problem of decay. Suddenly, the Royal Navy and the Army could transport vegetables, soups and roast beef for years without them spoiling. This tinned meat, later infamously known as bully beef, from the French bouilli or boiled beef, became a strategic asset. It allowed British columns to operate in environments where foraging was impossible. In the arid deserts of the Sudan or the rocky defiles of the northwest frontier, where no crops grew and no cattle grazed, the redcoat could open a tin and consume a meal that was, if not gourmet, at least calorically dense and safe to eat. It liberated the army from the tyranny of the harvest season. While indigenous forces often had to disperse to tend to their crops or hunt for food, the British force, carrying its own preserved ecosystem of supplies, could remain in the field indefinitely. The broad arrow, the distinctive mark stamped on government property, became a guarantee of quality and compatibility. Whether it was a tin of beef, a leather cartridge box, or a replacement lock for a musket, the stamp signified that the item had passed the rigorous inspections of the Board of Ordnance. It meant that a soldier standing guard in a remote outpost in New Zealand was equipped with exactly the same gear as a soldier on parade in London. This modularity turned the British Army into a machine where parts were easily replaceable, and the logistical friction that paralysed other forces was smoothed away by the oil of standardization. Yet, for all the efficiency of the supply lines and the interchangeability of the muskets, there remained an adversary that no amount of gunpowder could defeat. It was an enemy that did not wear a uniform, did not march in columns, and struck without warning in the dead of night. This enemy was disease. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the true grim reaper of the battlefield was not the cannonball or the saber, It was the microbe. For every soldier who died fighting the French, the Sikhs, or the Zulus, 10 might die of dysentery, cholera, or typhus. An army could be well-fed and well-armed, yet still dissolve into a hollow shell of invalids within weeks of arriving in a tropical theatre. Logistics, therefore, had to evolve beyond the mere provision of bullets and beef. It had to encompass the industrial-scale preservation of the human body. The British Empire engaged in a relentless scientific war against nature itself, transforming medicine from a localized art into a global, logistical imperative. The first great victory in this silent war was won at sea. For centuries, scurvy had been the scourge of long-distance voyaging. It was a horrific affliction that rotted the gums, caused old wounds to reopen, and eventually led to a painful death. It could decimate a ship's crew in months, turning a powerful man of war into a floating tomb. It limited the range of navies, tethering them to the shore and forcing frequent stops for fresh provisions. But the British Admiralty, acting on the findings of naval surgeons, began to treat health as a supply issue. They mandated the daily issue of citrus juice, initially lemon, later lime, to every sailor in the fleet. This was not a suggestion, it was a standing order, backed by the full weight of naval discipline. Massive quantities of juice were procured, preserved with rum to prevent spoilage, and shipped to every corner of the globe. The result was a strategic revolution. While French and Spanish crews withered away after weeks at sea, British crews remained healthy and combat effective for months on end. This medical logistics allowed the Royal Navy to maintain punishing blockades of enemy ports without ever needing to return to harbour, earning British sailors the nickname Limeys, and granting the empire a level of endurance its rivals could not match. As the empire expanded into the fever-ridden interior of Africa and India, the challenge shifted from the sea to the jungle. Here, the killer was malaria. The white man's grave, as West Africa was known, chewed up European regiments with terrifying speed. To conquer these lands, the British needed a chemical shield. They found it in the bark of the cinchona tree, the source of quinine. Quinine was an intensely bitter powder, but it was the only effective prophylactic against the malarial parasite. The British military supply chain began to pump tonics of quinine into the colonies by the barrel. But the logistics of distribution faced a human hurdle. The soldiers hated the taste. To ensure compliance, officers in the British East India Company began mixing the bitter powder with sugar, water, lime, and their daily ration of gin. Thus, the gin and tonic was born, not as a cocktail of leisure, but as a life-saving medical delivery system. This systematic distribution of quinine fundamentally altered the geopolitical map. It allowed British columns to penetrate deep into the Ashanti bush and the Burmese jungles, operating in environments that had previously been biological no-go zones for European armies. Field hospitals became integral parts of the supply train, moving alongside the ammunition wagons. The Army Medical Department standardized the pannier system, wicker baskets packed with pre-sorted surgical instruments, bandages, and medicines that could be strapped to a mule and carried to the front lines. By treating disease as a logistical problem rather than a stroke of bad luck, the British Empire drastically reduced the wastage of its manpower. They understood that a soldier in a hospital bed was a drain on resources, while a healthy soldier was an asset. The ability to keep an army standing on its feet in the sweltering heat of the tropics was a feat of organization as impressive as any cavalry charge. It was the hidden hand of the medical corps, extending the lifespan of the Redcoat and, by extension, the reach of the Union Jack. The ultimate vindication of this logistical way of war is found in the events of January 22nd, 1879. The defence of Rorke's Drift during the Anglo-Zulu War is enshrined in British legend as a triumph of grit and discipline. We picture the handful of Welshmen and Englishmen, outnumbered 40-1, holding back the flower of the Zulu impis. But if we strip away the romance and look at the physical reality of the battlefield, we see that Rorke's Drift was not a fort, nor was it a strategic strongpoint. It was a supply depot. The 150 men stationed there were not guarding a border. They were guarding the grocery list. The station was filled with sacks of mealies, corn, heavy wooden crates of hardtack biscuits, and boxes of tinned meat intended to feed the main invasion column. When the news arrived that the main British army had been annihilated at Isandlwana and that 4,000 Zulu warriors were descending upon them, the defenders did not have time to dig trenches or build stone walls. Instead, they built a fortress out of their logistics. The famous ramparts of Rorke's Drift were constructed from mealie bags and biscuit boxes. The soldiers were literally fighting from behind their own dinner. These heavy sacks, dense with grain, absorbed Zulu musket fire and provided the perfect height for a firing step. But the true decisive factor was not the food. It was the ammunition. In a typical battle of the era, a soldier carried perhaps 40 to 70 rounds of ammunition in his pouches. Once those were gone, his rifle became a club. But at Rorke's Drift, the defenders were sitting on top of the reserve stockpile. Inside the depot were crates containing tens of thousands of .450 Martini Henry cartridges. As the battle raged through the night, the Redcoats did not have to conserve their fire. They could maintain a relentless, rolling volley that broke wave after wave of Zulu attacks. Statistics tell the story. Over the course of the engagement, the small garrison fired nearly 20,000 rounds of ammunition. That is an average of over 130 rounds per man, a rate of fire impossible to sustain without an infinite supply at hand. The Zulus, brave as they were defeated not just by the men, but by the stockpile. They ran up against a wall of lead that simply never ran out. The British logistics system had placed a bottomless well of death in the middle of the African scrub, and that, more than anything else, determined the outcome. This concept of infinite supply extended to the grandest level of strategy, finance. The final pillar of the British logistical colossus was the Bank of England. War is the most expensive of all human endeavours, and the British method, paying for supplies, shipping them globally, and maintaining a professional standing army, was ruinously costly. Yet, Britain possessed a weapon more powerful than the cannon: credit. While Napoleon plundered Europe to balance his books, Britain borrowed. The British government could raise immense loans from the City of London and international markets at low interest rates, because they always paid their debts. In 1815, at the height of the struggle against France, the British national debt soared to over 200% of its GDP. To an observer, the country appeared bankrupt, but in reality, this debt was a war chest. It meant Britain could outspend every rival. They could subsidize allies, buying the armies of Prussia and Russia to fight on the continent. They could pay inflated prices for grain during a famine. They could build ships faster than the French could cut down trees. The hidden hand was, ultimately, a golden one. It was the ability to mobilize the wealth of an industrial nation and project it onto the battlefield. The Redcoats, standing his ground in the square formation, was supported by a supply chain that began in the foundries of Birmingham, passed through the counting houses of London, travelled along the trade winds of the Atlantic, and ended with the cartridge he slid into the breech of his rifle. He was the tip of a very long, very expensive spear. When we look back across the centuries at the rise of the British Empire, it is easy to be seduced by the theatre of it all. We see the dashing cavalry officers, the fluttering standards, and the desperate glory of the last stand. These are the stories that stir the blood and fill the history books. We remember the names of the generals, Wellington, Wolseley, Kitchener, and the names of the battles, Waterloo, Alma, Omdurman. But if we look closer, past the smoke and the glory, we see a different kind of heroism. It is the quiet, uncelebrated heroism of the commissary clerk, tallying barrels of pork in a humid warehouse in Bombay. It is the endurance of the muleteer leading a pack train through a mountain pass in Spain. It is the ingenuity of the engineer laying railway track across a burning African plain. The British Empire was not conquered solely by the fighting spirit of its soldiers, though that spirit was formidable. It was conquered by a system. It was a victory of organization over chaos, of industry over subsistence. While the enemies of Britain, whether they were the armies of Napoleon, the Maharajas of India, or the emperors of China, often relied on the brilliance of individual leaders or the fervour of their troops, Britain relied on a machine that could grind its opponents down, not with a single devastating blow, but with the relentless pressure of inevitability. The Redcoat was never truly alone. When he marched into the unknown, he carried with him the weight of an entire industrial civilization. He was supported by a network that spanned the globe, a web of ships, depots, telegraphs and banks that ensured he could keep fighting long after his enemy had run out of powder, food and hope. He was the end user of a supply chain that was the most sophisticated logistical construct the world had ever seen. This hidden hand was cold, calculating and immensely expensive. It lacked the romance of a cavalry charge. There are no paintings of supply wagons arriving on time. There are no songs about the timely distribution of quinine or the standardization of musket bores. But these were the victories that mattered. They were the silent victories that allowed the loud ones to happen. They turned the chaotic gamble of war into a manageable business proposition. In the end, the story of the British soldier in the 18th and 19th centuries is not just a story of combat. It is a story of reach. It is the story of how a small island nation off the coast of Europe managed to project its power to every continent on Earth, overcoming the tyranny of distance and the ravages of disease. They did it by understanding a fundamental truth that many of their rivals ignored, that a bullet is useless if it is 500 miles away, and a soldier is useless if he is not eaten in 3 days. The Redcoat's secret weapon wasn't his musket, his bayonet, or his discipline. It was the wagon behind him. It was the ship on the horizon. It was the ledger in the treasury. It was the unshakable, terrifying certainty that no matter how far he went or how hard the fighting became, the Empire would always be there to resupply him. The thin red line was real, but it held firm because it was backed by a thick, unbreakable line of supply. That was the true engine of conquest. That was how the map was painted red. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.